last time I was talking about New Netherlands, I believe, and we started off. It's kind of an odd. The only thing I really don't appreciate real well in Richard Nostrand's textbook that you're reading is the order of chapters. I don't really get that, but so I don't follow it. So what we're going to do here is I've talked a little bit of, I try to keep things a little bit more chronological than he does. And since in this course we only go through the 18th century, we only finish up with the 18th century, we get to spend a lot more time in the 17th century and even the 16th century. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the 16th century and actually sort of antecedents that are going on in Europe. Before we go there, I want to finish up talking a little bit about the Dutch. And I didn't mention too much, I know, but although today we're going to focus primarily on the tidewater of Virginia and the Chesapeake area, we started off by looking at, of course, the Spanish and the so-called Spanish borderlands of southern, the southern North America, the Caribbean, Mexico, and then eventually the Southwest. It takes a while for the Spanish to get to the Southwest, particularly to California. And then we talked a little bit about the French. We actually talked quite a bit about the French and the relationships between the French and the Indians. Just as a brief overview, what brought the French into North America in the first place? How would you characterize that in an elevator comment or whatever, we call those? Elevator talk, 2 or 3 sentences to explain something. The fur trade, yeah, the fur trade didn't bring them in, but it kept them there, all right? The fur trade was the only thing that was actually very lucrative. Initially, though, what brought the French was a combination of a lot of the other things that brought the English and the Dutch. It was the cod fishery. That's a really important thing we have to keep in mind. The cod fishery, or the great fishery as they call it. The great fishery was something that emerged over the course of a century or so. It was known, at least the fishery in the North Atlantic was something that certain groups had some experience with prior to Columbus, all right? So I'm going to try to push us back a little bit today to think about before Columbus. And anyway, keep in mind though, throughout the 16th century is this period of the expansion of that fishery in the North Atlantic. So the French were gradually moving toward the St. Lawrence Valley through that fishery because they were very active in the fishery. And who were the people in France? I mean, there was no France yet, really. Who are the people in what we call France who were active in the fishery? Were they the people of Paris? Were they people of Lyon? Were they, yeah, Tyler? They were Bretons and Normans. They were the Northwest French, the more Celtic French, in fact. So very different culturally and as we'll see from the rest of the country. And so they were seafaring people, just like the West Countrymen of England, the Bristol men of England who were involved in the fishery. There were other groups, the Portuguese, the Basques, who were also involved in this cod fishery. And of course, a lot of the maritime technology and expertise, experience that fed that fishery had originally come from the Venetian and Genoese seafaring city-states, the Italian city-states. It was the Italian mariners who really transferred a lot of that seafaring knowledge and technology to the Portuguese and the Spanish, and eventually that wound up getting to the North Europeans. But in a sense, I keep going back. I've taught this class for a really long time, and I keep going back to one big generalization that really affected the fate of North America in terms of European overseas colonization. And that massive generalization is that in Europe, in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, we have so many, so many dynamic things happening, and they all often come down to religion. Okay. Now, I'm always careful to try to persuade students that, yeah, there were religious dissenters that arrived into the Massachusetts Bay Colony and to Plymouth. And, the Separatists came to Plymouth, and the Puritans came to Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's about the only example of successful English settlement in the New World that was, for the most part, religious oriented. And, well, okay, we'll talk about Maryland. Maryland's a little different too. But for the most part, even the Puritans, once they were in command and control of Massachusetts Bay and New England for the most part, they became more mercantile oriented. They became less and less infatuated with religious settlement. Now, of course, you've in your history classes, you learn about Salem and witch trials and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, the Puritans wound up being very commercially oriented people. But we're not going to talk about Puritans today, right? We're actually going to talk about the Tidewater area, which was very much from the start a business proposition. It was all about money and all about making money, which takes us back to Europe. If you were to characterize these various societies in Europe that are sort of making sort of dents of exploration and perhaps foothold settlements in North America, well, you can almost kind of divide them into two groups. And I do this myself, but I don't try not to express it too much. I think of Europeans at this time in the 15th and the 16th centuries as sort of cultures, but also coming out of two major groups. You have the Roman Catholic Church, and you have the combination of the Southern Europeans with their heritage of Roman organization and centralized control and military might and planned settlements and conquest in transportation. Okay, you've got that particular group of mostly Southern Europeans, and they in 1492 had just experienced a fantastic victory. Everything was going well for them. In 1492, the victory, of course, is over the Muslims. And not only did the Spanish evict the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula in this reconquista, but they also took over a civilization that had been there for about 600-700 years and was thriving itself. The Spanish Muslims were doing very, very well commercially themselves. The Spanish, essentially, by evicting them and running them out of Spain, purifying Iberia to become a Christian peninsula again, also took over a lot of their wealth. The Spanish confiscated the wealth of a lot of these Muslims, a lot of these Moorish Spanish families, in fact. Okay, so the Spanish are on a roll. The Spanish are continuation. Their expansion overseas after 1492 would continue this conquest, and they had it for tens of generations to this point, really going all the way back to the Roman Empire. The Spanish had really been the heirs of the Roman Empire in terms of their military approach and their colonization and their conquest of other peoples. And they continued that on, of course, and got extremely lucky, even though the Pope was favoring the Portuguese when they drew up the Treaty of Tordesillas line, 1494. That's when they divided the earth into two halves, one for the Spanish, one for the Portuguese. But they didn't really understand, the Pope didn't know at the time, that he was handing the Spanish the New World, and he was handing the Portuguese Africa and the Far East. The Spanish wound up with the sweet part of that deal. And then, of course, they discovered the Aztecs and the gold, and the Incas and the gold and silver, and the huge populations in which they enslaved and they made into peasant farmers, and a very, two very large populations of people, lots of labor for looting these civilizations. And of course, the Spanish, who really benefited from this, of course, were the Habsburgs, the Habsburg Empire. If you're familiar with them, it doesn't really matter if you are or not, but basically these were the Spanish dynasty that was intermarried with Germans and Austrians and people in farther east in the Germanic areas of Europe and the Slavic areas of Europe. And so the Habsburg Empire had expanded, and the Habsburgs had a presence in the Low Countries. Okay, so this is where we have a connection between this Iberian Roman heir, this conquering machine of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, overseas empires, and a very, very different group of Europeans. In this case, we've got a new group of Europeans who have more or less rebelled against the church. These are the Protestants. And the Protestant Reformation, of course, you're familiar with the Protestant Reformation, right? When did the Protestant Reformation get moving? Okay, yeah, right, 1517 with Martin Luther, and then also with John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. But for the most part, in Central Europe and North Central Europe, we have the rise of Protestantism, and initially as a reform movement for the church. It's very important to know that during the 16th century, we've got this dynamic going on in Europe. And what happens? Well, Protestants initially are persecuted. Persecution is too light of a word, really. It depends on the group and the location, but it could range from the Spanish Inquisition to, being burned at the stake, to being run out of town, having your wealth taken, being discriminated against in business, whatever. And those early Protestants, if they were anywhere close to a place of Catholic power, then they had problems. And one of the groups that I really wanted to talk about, but I haven't done so yet, but I will now, are the Huguenots, the French Protestants. The French Protestants were the people who basically were followers of John Calvin out of Geneva, Switzerland. But the Protestants in France were actually a fairly numerous bunch. There were quite a few of them. And they were doing fairly well for a while. And in France, they were for the most part getting along. But what happened in for the most part, in the early or the mid 1500s, in the mid 1500s, the Roman Catholic Church being faced with this dilemma of these dissidents and these, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the true corruption in the church? What were some of the practices that the Roman Catholic Church was having to face up to by this time? Well, okay, maybe that's more history than you want. I'm a geographer. What? I have earmuffs on, so you have to really speak loudly. Indulgences, yeah, I was hoping somebody would say that. What's an indulgence? Yeah, it's just sort of like your traffic fines, right? So you're paying off your sins. So indulgences are this is corruption. It's basically a severe corruption of the whole system. And there are others, we don't need to get into that, but But for the most part, yeah, there were a lot of things that needed to be reformed. And so, how did the church go about attempting to deal with these things? The conference, yeah, of course, you have conferences. Yeah, they're still doing that here in academia, right? The Council of Trent, right, or Trento in Italy, and so this is like the really very first Vatican, okay? So they have these councils, and this lasted for years, and basically they're hearing all of these complaints and trying to figure out how to deal with them. So what do? Well, they buckle down, and for the most part, they say, you know, we're not going to tolerate these Protestants. We're doing things right in a lot of ways, and we're not going to tolerate it. So we have the emergence of this, particularly in France, of a counter-reformation. And the counter-reformation is what really launches the Huguenots. And the Huguenots had lots of, you know, because they were Protestant, and because of course, the emergence of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, in England, the rise of Protestantism there, they were natural allies. The Huguenots and the English, particularly the people in the northern and northeastern parts of France, were very much allied with the English, and they had other allies in the Low Countries. In the Low Countries, where the Habsburg Empire had connections, the Spanish were intermarried with these Flemish and Dutch and Walloon people. What occurred was, during the Protestant Reformation, you have the movement of large numbers of Protestants, large numbers of dissenters from some of the early centers of capitalism controlled by the Habsburgs to areas that weren't controlled by the Habsburgs. So what happens is places like Antwerp, okay, very important French Catholic city, loses its most, you know, productive population. It's very capitalist-oriented population to places like Amsterdam, just up the road. So Amsterdam becomes a magnet for dissenters. It becomes a place where Protestantism is free and protected. And then, of course, we have what's going on in Spain. Well, the Spanish are getting very, very rich from all of this bullion coming back to Spain, and somewhat because of the sugar industry, the sugar trade growing for the Portuguese and the Spanish. But the Habsburgs, you know, are bringing in all this cash, which is inflating the economies of Europe, and we have what's going on is lots and lots of debt. The Spanish essentially are losing a lot of this cash to trade that is being captured by people in the Low Countries, the Dutch for the most part. And so the Habsburg Empire would split, and you would have the Holy Roman Empire over in the central part of Europe, and the Spanish dynasties back in Iberia. So where does all this play out? Well, what's going on is you've got a brain drain. The Counter-Reformation was a generator of brain drain in France and in the Low Countries, and the people who were emigrating out were largely people who had some capital, that had some wealth. These were Protestants who were deciding to leave. And like I said, the Huguenots were among one of the larger groups. Huguenots would find they were searching for a new location to colonize, to get out of France, to sort of create a new France, but not like the old France, a Protestant France. And so actually the Huguenot explorers got started very early on the American coast, first around where the location of St. Augustine is today. The very first colonization or colony was actually a French Huguenot colony. The Spanish came in the 1560s and wiped them out. Okay, so they attacked the Spanish. So we have Protestant and Catholic animosity and rivalry along the very earliest coast of North America, very earliest settlements of Europeans along North America. There would also be Dutch going into the Chesapeake Bay before the English, which is bizarre to think of. What happened to them? Powhatan Indians wiped them out. So, you know, there were precedents or there were preceding examples of failure before the English. All right. Well, I talked a little bit about the Dutch. We talked, you know, the thing about the Huguenots is they would be searching for a new location to settle. And everywhere they went, they tended to get attacked by the Spanish. They wound up essentially merging into a movement of people from England and from the Low Countries. So a lot of Huguenots moved to England. A lot of them left France and wound up living in southern England and becoming involved in the fishery and some of the exploration that was taking place. So French Huguenots. All right, I may mention them again sometime, but the French Huguenots would become an important colonizing group, but they wouldn't really have the label. They wouldn't be able to carry the label Huguenot with them. Wherever the English settled, there were often a lot of Huguenots in the crowd. Okay, so they were Protestants. They kind of blended in. They were along for the ride. They had a lot to do with the colonization of Virginia and the Carolinas, particularly Charleston, South Carolina, as a strong Huguenot heritage, but so does Virginia. So anyway, all right, well, enough of that. If you don't mind, before we go there, okay, I don't have a whole lot of stuff for you today on the English, but I did want to recover what I wanted to cover in on Tuesday, and that was in the. Sorry, I'm not even realizing this is completely washed out, isn't it? No, forget that. All right, sorry. In discussing the Dutch the other day in what valley? Hudson Valley. Okay. It's odd because I only want to talk about the Dutch up until about 1664 when they get kicked out by the English, right? Or 1654, which one of those you want to consider the first, you know, or the final one. So the Dutch are in the Hudson Valley, and the Swedes are in what valley? Delaware Valley. Okay, so we've got two new, you know, outposts of North Europeans in the New World. For the most part, why were they there? They were there for the same reasons the French were there, and that was that they were trying to emulate Spain's luck. They weren't successful. The Dutch didn't find any great native civilizations. They didn't find gold, but neither did the French. The French got involved with the fur trade fairly early on, so the Dutch got connected into that. So that's pretty much the only thing the Dutch were really making money at. But there is that one thing called the patroon and the patroonship, and I want to make sure that I don't overemphasize that, but I want to sort of clarify a few things that I didn't cover last time. What is a patroon, and what is a patroonship? A patroon is essentially a wealthy investor from the Netherlands. Now, that wealthy investor may have been a Huguenot, may have moved into into Amsterdam. May have been a Flemish investor, but for the most part, we've got this brain drain, coming into Amsterdam. So we've got all these people in accumulation of money, of capital that wants to be invested in new things. So a patroon is one of these individuals, and a patroonship is the grant of land that the Dutch West India Company would make to that individual. So essentially an investor. Now, there really weren't very many patroonships, but they were very large. The largest patroonship, and I can never say this, but maybe some of you know how to say it, pronounce it, Rensselaerswyck, or Rensselaerswyck. You ever heard of that? Maybe I'm probably butchering the heck out of it. What? How do you say it? I don't know exactly, but I know people who are from there. Okay, Rensselaerswyck. All right. So anyway, that was the largest patroonship. It was 800,000 acres in size and straddled the Hudson River up near Albany. Okay, so 800,000 acres, pretty good size, But the thing about the patroonships is that, number one, there really weren't that many of them granted. They were fairly large, and the whole idea of the Dutch West India Company in trying to establish these patroons was to create a kind of a landed aristocracy. All right, it was a half-hearted attempt to establish kind of a land holding for wealthy folks. Now, this is done by a private company. It's not being done by the government. It's done as an attempt to establish people in the New World with some land, and it really didn't work very well. The problem, of course, was that those people who were allowed this land grant were also obligated to bring in settlers, and the only way they could do that was to pay them, and or pay their transportation over. And we've talked about that before. It's very expensive. Most people who came to the New World who didn't have some kind of sponsor, that is, if they didn't have a private company or they weren't moving as families and had money already, they did so through indentured servitude. And nobody did that in the Hudson Valley, really. So the Hudson Valley patroons, even though there weren't very many of them, they had a lot of land. They never had very many people to settle the area. So it's another example of an attempt by European culture to establish an old system that would probably be considered something like, well, what do we call that? Feudalism, sort of a feudal system. Thanks. Try to establish a feudal system in the New World, and it flopped. It was a total flop. Why? Because in the New World, everything was turned around. It was backwards compared to Europe. In Europe, labor was cheap, land was expensive, resources were expensive. In the New World, land was free, resources were there for the taking, but it was the labor, it was the workers, the people that were expensive. You couldn't get them to come, and if you ever could, you couldn't get them to stay because you couldn't pay them enough, and you certainly weren't going to force somebody to become a serf, right, or a peasant in the New World, because there were just way too many opportunities otherwise. So anyway, the patroonship system was just another one of these examples, and we'll actually see some more planned settlement systems established in the New World, but not right now. We're going to move on. Now, I wanted to say something else about the Dutch, in that the Dutch were highly, highly commercial folks. They were often the second arrivals in certain industries, but they often took over those industries. So an example would be the slave trade. The Portuguese, as you know, got the slave trade going off the west coast of Africa. The Dutch moved in on that slave trade. They didn't completely kick the Portuguese out of it, but the Dutch wound up taking over a lot of it. The sugar trade in the sugar islands was another example. The Spanish and the Portuguese and other groups, English later, would establish sugar islands. The Dutch wound up getting into a lot of the financial side of sugar. So the Dutch were crafty capitalist people, right? They didn't have a lot of natural resources. They were one of these maritime peoples like the English and the Japanese and the Phoenicians who had always purchased what they need elsewhere and brought it all together and made money at it. So and the Venetians and the Genoese and those folks. So we have the Dutch, and the Dutch, of course, would at times be allied with the English, but at times at war with the English, because they were pushing their own weight as a global power to some degree. All right, so the English. Let's talk about the English. Where do the English fall in all this? And why? I've got a note here. This reminds me to ask you why and how did the English ever get involved? What were the primary motivations for the English to begin exploration of the New World? What's the answer? Or what are the answers to that? We've talked about fish, right? They were involved in the fishery. So we've got cod. What else? Yeah. Okay, we've got the rise of privateering, right, against the Spanish. Where does all that emerge from? You got to go back to Elizabeth I, right? What happened with Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth? Yeah, and before that. Yeah. Was she angry at the Spanish? Why? She got excommunicated from the church. Church said, go to hell. All right? So Queen Elizabeth says, you're fair game. And Sir Francis Drake, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, some Huguenots. Huguenots were good mariners, like a lot of the English. The English didn't have very good technology. They didn't have the best technology until after people like Cabot and Columbus started spreading the Mediterranean shipbuilding technology to the north. And the way that really got started was because London was a member of the Hanseatic League up in the northern part of Europe, and what happened was the Mediterranean mariners started moving goods up to London and up to the Hanseatic League, and with that they had to build bigger ships in order to get around and get out into the Atlantic. You know, the Mediterranean's one thing, but the North Atlantic is a completely different animal. And so anyway, they built better and better ships, and that's where the English started picking up on shipbuilding. Now the English they didn't build huge ships yet. In fact, the historians, what do you call it? What's the great term for a naval historian? The maritime historians. Anyway, what they say is, that the English were, because they had sort of lighter, faster ships, they were able to outmaneuver the Spanish more frequently, and of course the big heavy Spanish ships got wiped out in 1588, right? So anyway, the English have these lighter ships. They're able to get involved in the shipping trade, and so they become in after 1570 or no, 1570. I think that's when she was excommunicated. Anyway, Queen Elizabeth says, develops this relationship with these pirates, right? And if these privateers are attacking the merchant marine or the Spanish bullion shipments out of the New World, well, so be it. We're not gonna prosecute. We're only going to tax. Okay, so the crown, the British crown, got a cut, and a wink and a nod. And even though it's international law and all that stuff, there was not a lot of international law at the time. So, okay, so that's a good answer. Thank you. I didn't mean to go on too long for that, but privateering, or what we might call sort of a parasitic relationship with the gold shipments out of the New World, right? What else? So what are the primary motivations for the English to begin exploration of the New World? Fisheries, privateering. Basis for attack on the Spanish fleet, which would include privateering. Basis for attack. What are some good bases for attacking the shipments that are coming up the Gulf Stream? Some good locations. They were all tried early on. Okay, but also Bermuda. Bermuda was a very, very important location to do that. The Outer Banks of North Carolina, the islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. So those were some of the early locations for these privateer establishments. Again, Huguenots involved a lot in the privateering business. Huguenots had personal problems with the Catholic Church, so they were out for revenge too. But other things that maybe we can't pull up yet. They also wanted they wanted to find that route to the east. They were still looking for a good route to get to the east, because of course nobody had much of a concept of, well, the Spanish knew where the Isthmus of Panama was. They were actually using Panama. They would move stuff up the west coast of South America, up the Panamanian coast. They would land in Panama, cross Panama, and then ship things up the Gulf Coast to Veracruz. Okay, so the gold shipments from Peru were actually crossing the Isthmus of Panama. There's no Panama Canal yet, though. So the Northwest Europeans, who are really out of the loop when it comes to moving through the Caribbean or what was becoming Latin America, they really didn't even have information about how far South America, was. So they were, they didn't have much experience there. So they kept looking for that Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage, what was the route? They realized that, the Arctic Ocean would thaw to a degree, and of course that brought the English up into Hudson Bay, into the north, but it was never very successful. But they were looking for that route to the east. So that's three things, right? So what are they again? The cod fishery, the Northwest trade route, the alternative route that nobody could quite find yet. Bases in the Gulf South for attacking the Spanish fleet coming up the Gulf Stream. And one other one. And this one is the weird one, the funniest one, and the most geographical one. Okay? And it's the most geographical because, well, and I'm not saying this is, to me, it's one of the funnier ones because, again, it's some academic sitting in some ivory tower that's coming up with great ideas for people on the ground, okay? And those ideas always fail, right? At least it's been my experience. So this is what's going on. There's this guy, an English geographer, okay? He has a name that's Dutch, but he's an Englishman. His name is Richard Hakluyt. Anybody ever heard of Richard Hakluyt? Does Dr. Nostrand mention him in the textbook? Okay, well, check him out. Richard Hakluyt, he was a geographer. He was, well, they didn't call them geographers back then, but he was doing academic sorts of geography, and he was working for the Queen. And so he came up with some ideas for, once the information about the coast of North America, the southeastern coast of North America, was starting to come back. People were colonizing in Bermuda and so forth, in the Caribbean. He started getting more information, and one of the potential things that Hakluyt came up with was, the English are still dependent on Southern Europeans, the Catholic part of Europe. They're still dependent on the southern part of Europe for all those wonderful consumer goods that we really like. All right. So what are some of those things? What are the commodities that are can only be produced in Southern Europe that are for the most part monopolized by the Venetians, the Italians, the Southern Europeans, the Spanish, and what sorts of commodities, agricultural commodities, would we, or manufactured goods? Tyler? Exactly. Wine, olive oil, salt from Africa. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I didn't think about salt. That's a good one. But things like Mediterranean crops, in particular wine and wine grapes. Okay. Now you can grow wine in France and Germany, of course, but the English have particular tastes, right? The English drink warm beer. Thank goodness for the Germans coming to America, right? They like port. Okay, now what's port? It's a blended, very strong wine that's Portuguese. So they were dependent on the Portuguese for their port. The English had to have their port. And so anyway, so the English have this. You can't grow vines in England. It's too wet and rainy, and they don't have the climate for producing wine. So they're dependent on an import. Therefore, you have another reason for another motivation to begin exploration of the New World. Because, a little geography here, what's the latitude of, Lyon and the Loire Valley, wonderful wine country of southern France and of Italy, of, well, a little more than that. It's Europe, so they've got the Gulf Stream. Okay, so right about 35. We here in Stilly, y'all say Stilly? Trying to force myself to say Stilly. See, I grew up in Stillwater, so hard for me to change the name of the place I live, but I'll call it. I like the term Stilly. Here in Stilly, we're at 36 degrees, pretty much, more or less, north latitude, 36 degrees, which still in mid-September is really hot. Okay, not so much in the same latitude in Europe because of the Mediterranean Sea, and about the same latitude in Europe, it would be like Southern California. All right. Unfortunately, we don't get Southern California weather in Oklahoma. Nobody moves to Oklahoma for the weather. That's my new slogan. All right. When people complain about the weather, I say, hey, look, nobody comes here for the weather. If you've come here for the weather, you're a moron. Okay. So, but people stay despite the weather. That's even better. Okay. They go to California for the weather. They go to Tuscany for the weather. So anyway, we're about the same latitude of, as Tuscany or southern Spain, all right, here in Oklahoma, where they grew all that wine. This latitude in Oklahoma is right at the same latitude as Chesapeake Bay, all right, Virginia. A little farther to the south, the Carolinas, okay, like southern Italy, Sardinia, Sicily, so forth. So they were assuming, because they didn't know anything about climate really, they assumed that climate was just a correlate with latitude. All right. This is what got the English in big trouble when they went to New England, okay? Because they're saying, okay, well, this is pretty similar to like, Germany, southern England, but no, it gets a lot colder in New England than it ever did in England. So anyway, the idea was that we could establish wine growing vineyard. We can establish a wine country in the New World because it's the same latitude. We could establish a wine country. We could establish a global trade in olive oil, which is a global commodity, okay, at this time, is needed everywhere. So we could also produce, so now you've just think a little bit, what are the British sometimes referred to in slang terms? Well, probably lots of things, depending on who you are. Yeah, and particularly British sailors. Okay. Not the one I was looking for, but I'll appreciate it. Limeys, right? So if you're a limey, what are you? Well, you're a British sailor. Why are you called a limey? Exactly. Yeah, they had to load up citrus fruit on the ships so that they wouldn't get the vitamin C deficiency and get scurvy and lose all their teeth, and it's a nasty way to die. So one of those commodities is citrus fruit, limes, lemons, oranges, whatever, grapefruit, I guess. So these citrus fruit can only be grown in the Mediterranean, in the southern part of Europe, right? You can't grow citrus any much farther north. So citrus orchards, okay, in Virginia, that's what they're thinking. Citrus, olive oil, wine. That means those are crops that make some money. Those are crops that can be exported to not just the home country, but to the global trade, the expanding market in Europe. So there were all sorts of ideas about this. Oh, another one was silk, and this was probably the only one that had any hope. They were wanting to establish silk plantations so they wouldn't even have a need to go to the Far East to purchase the silks, textiles and stuff. So all you need for silk production are the silkworms, or the moths, right? And what else? Mulberry trees. So mulberry trees were the key. So that would probably work, but I don't know. You know how that goes. Planting citrus orchards would be quite a mess. Anyway, so Richard Hakluyt, academic, got the same latitude as Southern Europe. Let's plant Southern European crops in the New World, make lots of money. It was enough misinformation, or it was a good guess, right? But without the knowledge of climate, without the knowledge of the environment. But it was enough to get investors to back these ideas that there would be a plantation. There would be a company called the Virginia Company, right? And the Virginia Company would then gain privileges to settle colonists in this new world with the intent that they would establish a viable staple crop to export to England, to the New World. Yeah. This was pre-tobacco, but it's exactly leading to tobacco. You're thinking along the right lines, okay? So as you might imagine, can you imagine these settlers showing up and trying to with their olive trees, in Virginia? Virginia's a little milder than Oklahoma, but not too different. Coastal Virginia is not too bad, but very humid, lots of rain, that sort of thing. So this is a similar map to what you've seen before. Remember, New York is not included in New England. But what I'm wanting to show you here is that the English had claim to the entire seaboard. They had an overlapping claim among the Virginia Company of London here in the south and the Virginia Company of Plymouth, which originally wanted to go to Virginia but got knocked off course by a hurricane and wound up in Massachusetts. So that's why the Puritans went to Massachusetts and not Virginia. The Virginia Company of London gets established in the Tidewater area, what we call the Tidewater area of Virginia. Okay. Now, what I want to show you here, and what I'm really only trying to show you, is that in your textbook, Nostrand refers to the South. All right, and that's another one of those things I wish you would fix, because even though these two colonies, Virginia, the Tidewater area along the James River initially, and then this area that we would later call the Low Country between Savannah and Charleston, this particular area of the coast of Carolina and Georgia, was settled by English, but they were, for the most part, pretty different. A lot of them were coming from the Caribbean, but a lot more of them came to Carolina from the Caribbean. So the Carolina settlement around Charlestown would be much more influenced by the Caribbean sugar economy, while the Tidewater settlement, the Tidewater system, would be more oriented toward looking for that ideal staple crop to export back to England. So, and of course they would be able to produce different things. The Carolinas would produce rice and beef, and later a little bit of sugar, and what we would refer to as indigo, right? And the Tidewater, as you were thinking, they tried all these things initially, but luckily John Rolfe early on brought in some tobacco from Cuba, Caribbean tobacco. Now the Indians, they smoked all kinds of stuff, all right, in the Tidewater. They smoked tobacco, but the tobaccos were very different. And the only tobacco that was going to make a lot of money was what was, standard in the Caribbean. And so they were able to find a type of tobacco, a strain of tobacco that did fairly well in Virginia, and it came from Cuba. So that would get the colony running. And of course, tobacco was a very lucrative crop, with a market that would become addicted, and kind of a sure thing. So it started making lots of money early. The Virginia Tidewater. Now I've got just a few notes here about some of the things here. In Virginia, for the most part, in comparison to Massachusetts Bay, these were not people that, except for the Huguenots perhaps, were not really religious dissenters at all. They were commercial minded, but I can say that the Huguenots were also very commercial minded. A lot of them were coming from, the second sons of the aristocracy, but a lot of them were poor. And after the 1690s, there would be an increasing amount of African slaves. But we're not going to talk about the 18th century yet. For the most part, it's an English and Huguenot colony. So anyway, land speculation and tobacco would be the money makers. Let's talk a little bit about the native peoples. Well, I guess not yet. Just some notes about early Tidewater Virginia. And here, we've already talked a little bit about this, but we can kind of recap a little bit. We were talking about privateering, supported by Queen Elizabeth, particularly in the latter part of the 16th century, the 1500s. The outer banks of the Carolinas were important bases for those early attempts. Now there is, you probably have heard about Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition in 1584 to Roanoke Island and around Pamlico Sound, and they established a colony. And what happened was they brought in some folks, and then they were supposed to go immediately back with a supply ship and bring supplies back in the next round, the next season. But what happened was they got weather and other problems wound up forcing the supply ship to be very, very late. So between 1587 and 1590, these 3 years, they didn't have any contact. And when they arrived, you probably know the story, right? It's kind of a cool story. When I think his name was White, the guy who was supposed to come back and bring them the supplies, he got there and the colony was gone. There were some there was nothing except what looked like a crude fort that somebody had built, and a carving on a tree that said Croatan or Croatoan, whatever that means. Okay, so nobody's really sure exactly what happened to the lost colony, except that they were all gone. Well, anyway, that was back in the 1580s. It took a while for the Virginia Company to get a settler colony going, but in 1607 is the very first one. So Jamestown on the James River was the very first one, of course. Mediterranean staple crops, olive oil, wine, citrus, those are the things we talked about. Hakluyt, this is Richard Hakluyt. He's the one with the ideas about latitude equaling climate, and also I didn't mention this. Hakluyt's another academic sort of idea that well, we've got these growing social problems in London, so why don't we take the have-nots, the people who tend to get into debt and that sort of thing, and why don't we move them to the New World, and then that way we will be rid of them here in England. All right. So a sort of social pressure valve, social population pressure valve. Well, that was another one of Hakluyt's ideas. I don't know. The New World may have offered some opportunities quite a bit later, but in the early 1600s, it was pretty much a death sentence if you were going to Virginia. Now, they didn't know that at the time, but the rate of mortality rate for Englishmen in the Chesapeake in the first couple of decades of the Tidewater settlement, 1607 to about 1630 or so, was brutal. Brutal because of disease, number one. A lot of them died really quickly of dysentery, all right, because they were drinking water that was in a tidal estuary. They were drinking water that was awful, awful quality. And then, of course, there were the Indians. And the Indians weren't completely ignorant of the whites. After all, there had been some attempts by Huguenots down the coast and Dutch right up in the Chesapeake earlier, and the Powhatan Confederacy had wiped them out. They didn't tolerate them. The English, eventually depended on England. Early on depended on the Indians for corn and for sustenance over their first winters. And when the Indians decided to raise the price, or decided they weren't going to deal with them anymore, the English got really desperate and eventually, raided the Indian crops, and of course the Indians retaliated. So really poor relations after the first couple of years. Well, anyway, the staple crop arrives in 1614, So that's when things begin to get a little bit better for these company private colonists. The best thing, I mean, I like science fiction and stuff, and one of the reasons I like historical geography is because I like science fiction. And I know it's strange, but Star Trek, for example, I was a big fan of Star Trek. I still am, and because to me, for a European to go over to the New World and in the 1500s or the early 1600s, it wasn't too far from the Enterprise dropping, beaming people down to planets. I mean, they were running into bizarre stuff, And anyway, we can talk more about that. Okay. Hopefully, we'll be doing the historical geography of the, of the solar system in another 1,000 years or so, right? So the settlement of Mars. My son thinks we're going to be on Mars by his, in his lifetime. I keep saying, no, never happen. Never happen. Might happen. Who knows? So anyway, I truly believe that if the human species is going to survive, we got to get out of here eventually. Okay. So, and I think we will. So, that's. So anyway, this is this is, just sort of part of that. Science fiction. Some good parallels to, like the Virginia Company. I don't know how much you like science fiction that much, but like the Alien series, the movies, especially the old one, the original Alien. Okay, what was the plot there? What was the initial setup? Yeah, so they wound up going to this. Was it an asteroid? But they were mining. It was a mining operation. It was a private company, right? Okay, I don't. You're the trivia guy, not me. But that's great. So it's a private and I haven't read the book, but probably the book is better. You've heard that one, but I ain't got time to read it. Plus, you don't see all the blood and guts in the book. Anyway, so in Alien, it's got there's this private company and they're doing things and they run into this awful acid blood alien that is mad, okay, because it's trying to raise its young. But can you imagine some of the things that these Englishmen in the Chesapeake are witnessing for the first time, and the fact that they're not getting out of there very easily. They're not. Once they're there, they got to stay. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting parallel that typically like in Star Trek or something. I'm sorry. In Star Trek, it's the Federation, right? It's old Cold War stuff. It came out in 1966 over 1969. If you watch Star Trek long enough, it's all about the Russians, and it's about Americans versus the Soviets and communism and so forth. And I guess the Klingons, who are they? It's like the savages from somewhere, but basically you've got the good Federation, right? And because it's a federation, it's reaching out to new places, establishing freedom, establishing democracy and free enterprise, probably. Enterprise. Interesting. Okay. So anyway, you got all that, that's all happening in Star Trek. But in Alien, it's a company. All right. And one of the lines I remember in the original Alien was the guy goes, "Man, I'm probably not going to get my bonus this year." Remember that? Right before he gets killed. So something like that. But anyway, this is a private company. It's a private action going on. It's not the British Crown. It's just people looking to make some cash and quickly. Okay. By 1650, the English had antagonized the Indians long enough that the there becomes a sort of a division, and this is really before 1650, but definitely by 1650, there's a division in the tidewater between land that is recognized as Indian country and land that is claimed by the English, claimed by the company. Powhatan is both the political leader of this confederation, also known as the Powhatan Confederation. And in 1622, they launched an attack to try to eradicate these foreigners, eradicate these aliens. And the result was that the English sent more people, and they came back with a vengeance. And the English began a systematic harassment to remove Indians from from territory that they needed. So the systematic harassment with the intent of getting Indians to move away, to get them out. Okay, so this is where we begin to see the very first Indian country, first Indian frontier. In 1644, another attack, 500 Englishmen killed, and there's not that many of them to begin with, a few thousand. But the English counter, and then they establish forts, basically what are referred to as blockhouses. But these are basically stations to watch and to keep tabs on the movement of native peoples. And the other thing about she mentioned about the Jamestown colony is that it's on the tip of a peninsula. It's surrounded by water. So there was a neck early on that they could defend and for the most part be fairly safe from attack. So they pushed that neck back. They pushed that frontier back, eventually establishing, maybe you shouldn't say that, but at the same time, all I really want to say is that at the same time that the English are doing this in Virginia, they had a legacy of colonizing in Northern Ireland. Okay. Now there are some people that like to make a close analogy between the English taking over land in Northern Ireland, and if you know the story about that, they took control from the Irish aristocracy, and then they would bring in Scots to farm the land and to take over the land and to basically hold the land. And so those people became known as the Scots-Irish, okay, or the Ulster Scots. Ulster was the colony, Northern Ireland. And then there are people that say, okay, well, that's the same thing that's going on with the Indians in the New World. Not really at all, okay? I would argue to say we can't really make much of a parallel there. Number one, the Irish have known the English for quite a long time. They were establishing a type of agriculture that worked, that nobody was, it was not experimental. And the Irish weren't necessarily ready to completely slaughter every one of the English, right? So the English in Virginia were up against something completely different than the English in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. They had no guarantee that they were going to survive. All it would really have taken was, for a more concerted effort on the part of the Indians. They could have easily wiped them out, but they didn't. They were split in some ways for that. Okay, well, it's probably about time to hang it up. So we'll continue to talk about the English. Now, just keep in mind that at this point, this is a physical map. I think I've shown it to you before. Physical map of the East. And we're talking about the tidewater. This is the area that is very low and flat for the most part. And we're not going to talk much about prior to the first exam. We're not even going to get into 1700. Okay. So all I'm going to be talking about, and I'll show you this stuff next time, but if you look at the shaded area on this map, this area around the Chesapeake is as far as we're going to bother with prior to the first exam. So The footholds, these are the areas that were pretty much settled or claimed by the British by 1620. And then the other shade, the next darker shade, is that area that was colonized by 1700. Keep in mind, that's nearly a century, okay? Nearly a century to get just this tiny little area that you could ride a bike easily from here to there, you know, in an afternoon, okay? So anyway, it's a really small, tiny, bitty area, but we'll talk more about the English next time. So have a good weekend and go Pokes.